so much, Jahan, and it's exciting about your new center. And you'll see that we're all three in sync. It's absolutely amazing. I recently wrote on Carl Andre, so yeah, for the dear Andrea's poetry. So when I perked up, that was so wonderful. Of course, we're all on the Baroque. Anyway, in an early scene in James Joyce's The Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, young Stephen Dedalus, a homesick schoolboy at Clongowes Woods College, is leafing through his geography textbook. Most of you know this passage. And we get Stephen Dedalus, I hope you can all see. Right? Stephen Dedalus, class of elements, Clongowes Wood College, salads, County Kildare, Ireland, Europe, the world, the universe. That was in his writing, and Fleming, one night for a cod, a joke, had written on the opposite page, lower part of the screen, Stephen Dedalus is my name, Ireland is my nation, Clongowes is my dwelling place, and heaven my expectation. And right after that, Joyce has this sentence. He read the verses backward, but then they were not poetry. And I stopped. I recently reread the portrait, and I went over that sentence again and again. I couldn't get over it. He read the verses backward, and then they were not poetry. Of course not, because poetry is Stephen, like all children of his day, indeed like all readers before the 20th century was taught, is written in metrical verse. In this case, the common ballad stanza, using trochaic, dactylic meter, and rhyming ABCB. And so, of course, one cannot reverse lines, much less words, and have a proper poem. Today, 100 years after the publication of the portrait, the situation in poetry is very different. Some people would claim that Stephen's own entry might be considered a poem, its lineation putting great stress on the individual words culminating in universe. Expectation, we could say, we could derive pleasure from it, we could play around with it. My heaven and dwelling place. There are lots of poems that look like that. So why not? Why can't you turn it around? It was Joyce, and rhyme, by the way, is no longer a requisite for poetry, and neither is any kind of fixed meter today or any recurrent rhythm. It was Joyce and his contemporaries who first questioned the poetry-verse relationship. Walt Whitman is sometimes cited as the father of free verse, but the fact is that Whitman's long lines, although avoiding rhyme and meter, are marked by anaphora, repetition, and marked recurrence of phrasal rhythm, clearly differentiating these lines from prose, and they're certainly not reversible. I celebrate myself and sing myself, and what I assume you shall assume, and for every atom belonging to me, as good belongs to you. I loaf and invite my soul, I lean and loaf at my ease, observing a sphere of summer grass, and so on. Very structured. It was Joyce's friend, Ezra Pound, who created the revolution we associate with 20th century poetry. In English, a poem like The Coming of War, Actaeon, is a spatial as well as a verbal construct, and we've been hearing about spatial constructs. Just to read it through quickly, again, I'm assuming many of you know it. An image of Lethe and the fields, full of faint light, but golden gray cliffs, and beneath them, a sea, harsher than granite, unstill, never ceasing, high forms with the movement of gods, perilous aspect, and one said, this is Actaeon, Actaeon of golden breeze, over fair meadows, over the cool face of that field, unstill, ever-moving, hosts of an ancient people, the silent cortege. Now here the layout mimes the poet and the reader's process of discovery. The gray cliffs are seen first, and only then, in the next indented line, do we learn what is beneath them, namely a sea. By the time you get to the peace and cantos, skipping very quickly here, but you'll see why in a minute. A given page will contain anything from Chinese ideograms to abbreviations, let's say line 18, if you can see down that far, you would come here with the phonetic spelling of WD for wood. Pound was probably the first person who ever did that, put in passages like that. To phonetic spelling, mine eyes have seen near the bottom of the page. Well, yes, they have seen a good deal of it. Or in line 23, two-thirds of the way down, contract W110090, phonetic spelling of a phone number of that sort. But again, Pound would probably be the first to do this. And he introduces foreign phrases, citations, all arranged to create a unique spatial design. Pounds of pages that have to be seen, read aloud, the effect of the four italicized words in line 11, so about a third of the way down, hot, hole, hep, cat. Hot, hole, hep, cat. It isn't the same if you just hear it. If you see it, first of all, the previous line, the cat comes back. There are all kinds of references where the whole thing relates. So every word is actually quite carefully chosen to relate to another word a page earlier or later on the same page. Now, Pound's contemporaries didn't go as far as he did, but bear in mind that St. Mary and Moore also renounced traditional metrical forms by using syllabics. In a poem like The Steeplejack, this chosen stanza has a syllable count of 11, 10, 14, 8, 8, 3. It always will look that way on the page. Now, reading it aloud, we elide line endings since the stress count is irregular, but on the page the stanzas match nicely. Dürer would have seen a reason for living in a town like this, with 8 stranded whales to look at, with the sweet sea air coming into your house on a fine day, from water etched with waves as formal as scales on a fish. Now, of course, English is a stress language, so syllabics is a little bit of an exercise because you're never going to hear it that way because the stress overrides the syllabication, but it makes for visual pattern. And even Eliot's Wasteland uses spatial devices throughout for special effects, as, for example, the setting of the phrase, unreal city, in that end. The unreal city. Don't forget Pound, the line originally was, unreal city, I can sometimes see it, something like that. It was a longer, much longer line, and Pound just went right through it, unreal city, and that's it become a famous line. Now, early 20th century poetic design was, as Buchanan notes in his delightful short book, The Mechanic Muse, closely linked to the invention and development of the typewriter. When we compare the poems of W.B. Yeats, 20 years Pound Sr., always first written in longhand and then typed out, often by someone other than the poet, to the lyric of Pound, the difference is startling. Yeats had no use for blank verse, much less free verse. If I wrote of personal love or sorrow in free verse, or in any rhythm that left it unchanged, amid all its accidents, I would be full of self-contempt, because of my egotism and indiscretion, and foresee the boredom of the reader. I must choose a traditional stanza. Even what I alter must seem traditional. Now, not surprisingly, Yeats disapproved of Pound's cantos, which do experiment with what Stephen Dedalus would consider the not poetry, like reading lines backwards. And this is what Yeats said. I'm sorry, I went too far. I can't sing from here, so do we have this long passage beginning like other readers? Like other readers, I discovered present merely exquisite or grotesque fragments. Oh, it keeps moving, that's why. This is very peculiar. Okay, is it right now?
Yeah.
Thank you, sorry. Can impressions that are in part visual and part metrical be related like the notes of a symphony? When I consider Pound's work as a whole, I found more style than form, at moments more style, more deliberate nobility in the means to convey it than in any contemporary poet known to me. But it is consistently interrupted, broken, twisted into nothing by its direct opposite nervous obsession, nightmare, stammering confusion. Style and its opposite can alternate, but form must be full, sphere-like, single. Even when there's no interruption, he is often content, if certain verses and lines have style, to leave unbridged transitions, unexplained ejaculations that make his meaning unintelligible. Even where the style is sustained throughout, one gets an impression, especially when he's writing vers libre, that he has not got all the wine into the bowl. Not to get all the wine into the bowl. Yeats, interestingly, had similar reservations about Joyce's development. Having praised Ulysses upon its publication in 1922, telling Pound that he was reading it a few pages at a time as if it were a poem, and that some passages have great beauty, lyric beauty, Yeats was soon admitting that he never finished them all. As for Finnegan's Wake, that hybrid text, published the year of Yeats' death in 1939, evidently that stymied Yeats completely. Finnegan's Wake, that was too much. Now, Yeats was, of course, on the losing side, so far as modernist and especially avant-garde experimentation was concerned. But where do we stand a century later? By the 1960s, such poets as Yeats, Robert Frost, and Philip Larkin notwithstanding, Anglo-American poetry generally meant free verse. Black Mountain poets, New York poets, Beats, the movement poets, all wrote free verse. And today, free verse, usually a diluted version of such early models as Frank O'Hara's I Do This, I Do That poems, Abby enriches snapshots of a daughter-in-law, has become so fully the norm that when one picks up any periodical or anthology of new poetry, it is taken for granted that the poems included do not use meter, stanza form, or rhyme. Even the designation sonnet today usually means no more than that the poem in question has 14 lines, which I have to say I think is very easy to do. So when people keep calling these things sonnets, I don't understand why they call sonnets. Nothing, no scheme. Terza-rima now often refers just to the use of tercets, open tercets, but lacking the difficult rhyme scheme A, B, A, B, B, C, B, C, of Dante and Shelley. For a variety of reasons, much of contemporary free verse, the staple of our own poetry magazines, anthologies, and individual collections, is curiously indifferent, both to the experimentation of the avant-garde and to the more immediate revolution of our own day, which is, of course, the digital revolution. Now consider the popular poetry of Sharon Olds, who recently won... Who recently won the coveted Wallace Stevens Lifetime Award from the Poetry Foundation of America. Here from the volume Stag's Leap, 2002, which chronicles the pain of Olds' divorce after 22 years of marriage, are the first 15 lines of the 33-line Telling My Mother. Outside her window, a cypress under the weight of the Pacific wind was bending luxuriously. To tell my mother that my husband is leaving me. I took her on a walk, taking her fleshless hand like a passerine's claw. Bought her a donut and a hairnut. I fed her. On the gnarled magnolia in the fog, the blossoms and buds were like all the moons in one night, full gibbous crescent. I practiced the speech, bringing up toward the truth slowly, preparing her. And the moment I told her, she looked at me in shock and dismay. But when will I ever see him again? She cried out. Now, for Olds' admirers, what makes this text a poem is evidently, I say evidently because I'm not quite sure, its sense of authentic voice. The poet tells it like it was, not disguising any of her feelings and pinning them down with some precision. The poems, writes a recent reviewer, and this is last week's TLS, find their strength in subject matter conveyed with a conversational ease, in a quite praiseworthy review. So find the strength of their subject matter conveyed with a conversational ease. The reader can readily identify with this poet who doesn't paper over her difficulties or blame others for them. Written in straightforward sentences draped over the sequence of lines, there's little figure language. The simile of the fleshless hand as passerine, a canary's claw, relates, of course, to the gnarled magnolia and the gibbous crescent moon further down, all images of the withering of old age that poor mother represents. But otherwise, the language is straightforward enough. Indeed, the language of prose memoir. So I just took the lineation away, but I want to read it to you this way. Outside her window, a cypress under the weight of the Pacific wind was bending luxuriously. To tell my mother that my husband was leaving me, I took her on a walk, taking her fleshless hand like a passerine's claw. I bought her a donut and a hairnut. I fed her. And the moment I told her, she looked at me in shock and dismay. But when will I ever see him again? She cried out. Now, Telling My Mother is immediately identifiable as a poem because it is lineated. But what I've called elsewhere the linear fallacy, the notion that lineation as such guarantees the status of a text as a poem, should give us pause. Not only can I represent Olds' poem as prose, as I've done above, right below it, I altered the line breaks without, I think, causing any appreciable change. I defy you to show me later that the line change actually makes a difference. Outside her window, a cypress, under the weight of the Pacific wind, was bending luxuriously. To tell my mother that my husband is leaving me, I took her on a walk, taking her fleshless hand like a passerine's claw. So I just altered the lines just a little bit. My difficulty with such writing is that there seems to be no observable relationship between Telling My Mother and the modes of production involved in its genesis, transmission, and publication. Given contemporary sound and visual technologies, the possibilities of montage, splicing, mashing, overlay, erasure, multimedia, it is hard to understand why a poem should still be equated with a lineated block of black print, almost always in loose free verse, surrounded by the white space of a book or a magazine page. In this regard, the mainstream press, say Alfred Knopfler for R. Strauss, the London Review of Books, the New Yorker, is much more cautious than the PowerPoint programs we all use. A program that gives its user choice of font size, color, shadow, rotation, and so on. It really seems to be curiously behind the times. Consider, too, the role of the digital archive in changing our ways of thinking about poetry. When I was in graduate school, Blake's songs of innocence and experience were known primarily through anthologies that featured the sick rose and the tiger, the nurse's song and the clod and the pebble, side by side with Wordsworth's Lucy poems and Keats's odes. We knew these little songs of experience had their illuminated plates. But these could only be studied in special collections in the library, and they were kind of extra. Now that we have superb reproductions online in the various Blake archives, here's the sick rose, it is understood that Blake designed books, not individual lyrics, and that the tiger is to be understood in its context, which is first of all its page context. That means that an entirely different way of studying Blake's later prophetic books is also possible. And if this is the case with Blake's illuminated plates, why not create new poetic texts that explore similar verbal, visual parameters? Poetry, said Ezra Pound famously, is news that stays news. It is the discourse that cannot be read and consumed at a single reading. It can only be reread. And as Wittgenstein put it, do not forget that a poem, although it is composed in the language of information, is not used in the language game of giving information. In this sense, poetry is a timeless art. We associate it with intensity, condensation, complexity, and figuration, whether tropical or rhetorical. Each age, however, makes use of the poetic technologies appropriate to it. And in ours, the blurring of boundaries between the verbal and the visual, the verbal and the musical, between individual languages, genres, and media, is bound to create new options and demands. For one thing, poetry has become increasingly differential. That is, the poem is no longer a fixed, immutable text on the page. It often adopts variants, so that the print text may morph into performance or video, or become the occasion for installation. In his recent Sao Paulo Museum retrospective, Rêve, for example, the Brazilian concrete poet Augusto de Campos has even rendered one of his poems as a sculpture. And this is called Código. I owe my knowledge of Augusto de Campos to Roland Green, by the way, who first introduced me to these poets years ago. It's a long story, but I think of it all the time. Anyway, Código, the Portuguese word for code, was originally designed for the page, as you see it here. A complex ideogram, Código, the word immediately evokes the Latin cogito, the short form of Descartes, cogito, ergo sum, contains in its center the palindrome God, dog. But in Portuguese, código is also a paragram. Co plus digo, I speak, yields I co-speak. I speak collectively. The notion of collective speech is expressed by the circular design of de Campos's Código, cogito. A few years ago, Campos transformed his concrete poem into a metal sculpture. The central straight line bisecting the poem now extended to make a rod connecting Campos's globe to the square platform on which it stands. As if to say, the code is we speak, therefore we are. And notice that the middle black circle opens up as if to call the ideogram into question. This next little section is called infrathin. Código, cogito, code. Campos's ideogram is much closer to conceptual art than to conventional lyric. The Brazilian poet reveals nothing about his personal life, although his way of making poetry is highly individual. The aesthetic that stands behind such new poetries, even when the poet is not fully aware of the derivation, Augusto de Campos doesn't talk much about him, but when I said, don't you think it is a key influence, he said, yes, of course, is that of Marcel Duchamp. The idea of repetition, Duchamp told an interviewer in 1960, is a form of masturbation. By repetition, he had in mind the hardening of what are originally innovative ideas and techniques into a signature style that is then trotted out again and again so as to please the art public and earn fame and fortune. His own friend Man Ray might have been a case in point, because Man Ray, I mean, the wonderful works, in later life they become slightly imitations of his own earlier work. It's true of a lot of poets. Here an observation by John Cage is a posit. If we take the path of looking for relationship, we slip over experience-wise all those things that are obvious, like repetition. But if we change our mind and turn utterly around and refuse the business of relationship, we will be able to see that those things that we thought were the same are in fact not the same. That's a big Wittgensteinian theme. Isn't the same at least the same? It never is, Gertrude Stein said. And this is very useful in our lives, which are more and more going to have what appears to be repetition. Now, in a word like that, the perceiving of difference in the repeated mass-produced items is going to be of the greatest concern to us. Repetition, as Cage and Duchamp understand it, is the downside of art making in the age of mass production. What is needed instead is a focus on difference, on the markers that identify a specific work, despite its seeming likeness to others. Replication can thus be understood as a form of what Duchamp called the delay, a delay in art, which he called the 9 Malic modes and so forth, a delay. If the artist or poet takes his or her earlier work seriously enough to re-present it, inevitably in revised form, since revision is inherent in the mere act of replication, the reader-viewer is challenged to delay or defer contemplation. And of course, Duchamp's own contribution to this was to make the boxes. And you can now buy, I got it on, at a bookstore in LA, which you can buy it on Amazon.com, a replica of the green box. And I assure you, it's I've seen the original at the Getty, the Norton Simon has it too, and of course the original is a replication anyway, and the one I have is perfect. I mean, it just looks exactly like the real thing. And you have all the notes in it and everything else. It's my new toy. I have it out. I didn't take a very good picture of it, but anyway, just wanted to just show you that and what interest is making. But the point is that the difference in question, that is by making all these things, reducing the fountain, the chocolate grinder, all these different things to small things, representing them. There's the famous story of Walter Benjamin running into Duchamp, and he had done a nude descending a staircase, but with rather different colors. It looked quite different in miniature form, and saying, oh, I love this one. This is the one that's really striking. They are all different, and you become very aware of difference, little differences. And Duchamp called this the infrathin, the afromass. A word that he said couldn't be translated, it could only be exemplified. The warmth of a seat which has just been left is infrathin. Subway gates, the people who go through at the very last moment, infrathin. Velvet trousers, their whistling sound in walking by brushing of two legs is an infrathin separation signaled by sound. Infrathin separation between the detonation noise of a gun, very close, and the apparition of the bullet hole in the target. So you start looking for the very smallest, minuscule differences in a way. In Thierry Didou's words, the infrathin separation is working at its maximum when it distinguishes the same from the same. Now think of information retrieval on the computer. One wrong or missing letter or accent or space, and often you won't be able to access the item you're looking for. We've all had that experience. One wrong number or space when you provide your credit card and it's invalidated immediately on your bank card. Formatting, symbol, hyperlink, all these depend upon 100% accuracy of reproduction and the correct choice of yes or no. There are no maybes when it comes to internet, shopping, or passwords. Infrathin verboten. The poet in these circumstances becomes the person who can call this uniformity into question, like the now we just saw Carl Andre. And given electronic text demand for 100% alphabetical and numerical accuracy, poets are paying more attention than ever to the individual letter, the morpheme, the phoneme, the empty space. Peter Gizzi has recently published a poem called When Orbital Proximity Feels Creepy that concludes with the lines, the wobble of light on wood grain late in the day, in the loneliness of orange, in the loveliness of orange. Now, after all, a V is nothing but an inverted N. All you do there is change one letter, and you get change. And you see a lot of people doing this now because we really are much more aware, I think, than we've ever been of the individual letter, sound, and so on. Now, just now, a short section on some Brazilian examples. In the mid-60s, Augusto de Campos made a computer version of his single-line poem, Cidade, City, City, originally printed on a pull-out page from a book. The poem consists of one long horizontal word string, which you've got here, made from 29 prefixes that, when complemented by the suffix cité, create a series of nouns, all of them attributes, concrete and contradictory, of the modern metropolis, the cité, city, cidade of the title. Note that Campos's poem is trilingual. He has chosen words that are almost identical across Portuguese, English, and French. For example, atrocity, multiplicity, velocity, and of course, city itself. And there's the whole list in alphabetical order, but in the interest of time now, I'm going to read him, play it for you.
capacaustic elástico periférico histórico, locolumini multiple periferiori plastic Viva reciprocus saga sentite na vera vida unívora city.
There are numbers of versions of this. This is what has happened. He originally did these in the 60s, early 70s. Then he did them in various other versions. Now here is a different version again with a computer punch card and a musical accompaniment. And I just want to show you the possibilities. Here it is, slightly with film and music.
Talvez o mais curto poema longo, ou quem sabe, o mais longo poema curto que já se escreveu sobre esta cidade. 150 letras, numa só linha.
That's his song, Sid. And at the recent festival in Brazil, with thousands of people, this is where poetry comes alive. It's very good treatments.
A troca do capacaustic duplo elástico periférico história, logo alumínio múltiplo periferiori plastic Viva reciprocus saga sentite na vera vida unívora city.
Okay. Now, just two more. Augusto's concrete poems have also lent themselves to an adaptation by younger poets. One of his most famous concrete poems is the seemingly simple 1973 ideogram, Viva Vaya, composed of red and white triangles representing just 4 letters, V-I-V-A, reproduced as the cover of one of Augusto's most important collections covering the years 1949-79. It's also been rendered as a 3-dimensional piece. Viva, long live, hooray, versus boo, common sports cheer. The unit, Viva Vaya. Augusto had in mind the contrast between the audience responses triggered it to the great Tropicalismo singer Caetano Veloso at a rock concert in 1968, Viva, and the Vaya condemnation of the same performance by the newly installed junta that was to arrest and jail Caetano Veloso for purported political crimes. The red and white triangles call into question the binary opposition of Viva versus Vaya, as does the fact that the two terms use exactly the same letters. Now, recently, the younger Brazilian poet, Andre Vallias, trained as a graphic designer, made an animated sound version of Viva Vaya. I'll just play you that. This just calls into question the furious debates we have between two sides that are often, in fact, very similar. In a similar way, his 2015 piece, I'm going to end with this, Hexaemeron, The Six Faces of Haphazard, that was just done 2 years ago, ironizes the genre of theological treatise that meditates on Genesis. And this is something he picked up on the computer and got interested in, and you'll see how it plays out. The Hexaemeron questions God's creation of the universe in 6 days. The one Vallias cites is the 6th century Christian topography of Cosmas Indiokoplestes, a Byzantine monk, a book readily available in various editions, the best known that of Eric Winstead, written at the turn of the 20th century, but often reprinted most recently in 2009. The musical accompaniment, appropriately chosen for such weighty theological discourse, is taken from Steve Reich's music for pieces of wood. And here's the frontispiece taken from Cosmos, which raises the question of why God couldn't have created the world in a single day. And then you'll see it modulate into a kind of graphic design of the single word lessness or lessnesses. Originally I thought that was Beckett's lessness, but it isn't. I mean, curiously, he said it was not influenced by that. But anyway, I'll play this for you in a minute. In a note, Valius has suggested that he always associated the 6 days of creation with the 6 faces of the dice, contesting Einstein's idea that God doesn't play dice. The creation as he sees it in the elaborate grids he constructs, which you'll see from LESN, are very interesting. So let's just play that. Just to conclude, in works like this, the viewer becomes actively involved in the poetic process. Indeed, the verbal features combining with Reich's ominous score combine to produce, at least for me, a sense of extreme irresolution. The creation of the word turns out to be no more than an elaborate bet like a coup de dé, the 6 faces of haphazard. It recalls Samuel Beckett's lessness, also a permutating prose text, not unlike Valius's in spirit. So in his brief compass, Hexameron thus refigures the relation of word, letter to word, graph to weighty moral statement, and of ancient text to contemporary music. Now this paper continues with a long analysis of Susan Howe. That's actually the subject of the paper, but in the interest of time, we're going to stop here.